To introduce our very special guest, Kenneth Bain, author and president of the Best Teachers Institute, and he's a lecturer who lectures all over the world. And the other day when I called him, he said, Phyllis, in 5 minutes I have a talk for over 1,000 people. So I hung up very quickly, of course. I wasn't going to stop it. And he could tell it to you later about it. But Ken, you first spoke here on October 2nd, 2014 on the topic, The Last Journey Home, FDR and the Middle East. And since then, your book and everything, Ken spoke on FDR and American history, Roosevelt and the Pearl Harbor, and FDR's vision of a second Bill of Rights, which was fascinating. Today's topic, when we were talking about what to do, what I thought, he said, let's do something timely. How and why the concept of race was invented. Well, what could be more timely than what's happening now? So, Ken, I want to thank you, first of all, for being so wonderful and donating your time to our library. And it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our very special guest, Ken Bain.
Thanks, Phyllis. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate the opportunity of being here. As you can see, I'm down in the Bahamas right now. I only wish. If I take away the virtual screen, you can see the mess in my office. It's pretty gruesome. But actually, I'm going to frame the question we're going to pursue today a little bit differently. And it's this: what is the concept of race? And where and why did it originate? So we have to begin with, what is the idea of race? How do we define the idea of race? And basically, historically, the idea of race has been that we can classify people according to biologically inheritable physical characteristics, and then can assume that those physical characteristics tell you something about the people, tell you something about their goodness, about their qualities, about their brilliance, about their inabilities, or something of the sort. Now, human beings come with all sorts of biologically inherited physical characteristics. And so some people say to themselves and to each other that, well, race is something that exists in nature. But that's not so. And I want you to think about why that is not the case. Because while those physical characteristics exist in nature, you know, some people are born with high cheekbones or low cheekbones, or people were born with a propensity to lose their hair when they get a little bit older. And some people are born tall and some people are born short. We all have different physical characteristics. But human beings decided, get this, decided to characterize people by their skin color. Now, why did we do that? Why didn't we, for example, and I want you to think about this, why didn't we break people up according to some other biologically inherited physical characteristic, like height, for example? If you look at human DNA, where all of those biologically inherited physical characteristics come from, in our DNA, our characteristics are controlled by different facets of our DNA, and the percentage that controls any one characteristic is extremely small. But guess which characteristic, which biologically inherited physical characteristic occupies the biggest portion of our DNA? But it's only about 2%, by the way. But it is the single biggest portion of our DNA. So Larry Pinto, a biologist at Northwestern, tells me. Guess what it is? It's height. So what if we characterize people, divided them up according to their height? And there are short people and there are tall people and there are people in between. And we said, and we decided that, well, we're going to create people into races according to their height. Now we would look at that and say, that's a pretty silly idea. But that's what we did with the idea of skin color. Now, what if we, for example, did something even sillier? And you look at the back of your finger and ask yourself, do you have any hairs growing out of the back of your finger? Now, that's a biologically inherited physical characteristic. We could divide up the world according to the people who have hairs or lots of hairs and people who don't have any hairs on the back of their fingers. That would be pretty silly. So where did this crazy idea of dividing people up according to skin color come from? That's the reason why historians say that the idea of race is a human invention. It's not something that exists in nature, in biology. The decision to cut people into different segments according to their biologically inherited physical characteristic, namely skin color, was a human decision. Well, where did we get that tendency, that idea of dividing people according to skin color? Well, if you look at human history and the ideas of human history, you will find that that idea has not always existed. In fact, it did not begin to appear until the 16th century, the 1500s. And it appeared in a particular place. And it did so not because the people living in that place were some kind of weirdos. It appeared for some very clear historical reasons. And a historian by the name of Winthrop Jordan was really the first to investigate this on a comprehensive scale. The book that he published back in the 1960s called White Over Black. He was a historian at the University of California at Berkeley. And then he decided that he would move to the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. And he stayed there until his death a few years ago. But his book, White Over Black, is a comprehensive study. It's about that thick. So he looked at every aspect of why this originated in England in that period. And he finally concluded that it was a result of a historical coincidence. Namely, that the English experienced a sudden contact with dark-skinned people in sub-Saharan Africa. As a culture, they had never had any contact with dark-skinned people. They themselves were these kind of pinkish. When people ask me if I'm white, I say, no, I'm kind of pinkish. If you don't believe me, let me hold up a white piece of paper here. You can see the difference. Well, I don't know if it'll show up here on the camera, but if you hold up those of you who say you're white, hold up a white piece of paper to your skin and you will see, nah, you're not. You're maybe like me, a kind of pinkish color, but not white at all. But why did we decide that this was such an important distinction between white and black? Well, because the English suddenly came into contact, Jordan argues, with these dark-skinned people. And what they discovered in these people who lived in sub-Saharan Africa, the English because they had had no contact up to this point, had no references in their culture. All of the references to dark-skinned people that appear in English culture and English literature crop up for the first time in the 1500s, the late 1500s, the Shakespearean age, because this is their first contact. And as they came into contact with these people, they discovered a people who were not only a different color than they were, but they also had a very different culture. Now, those people were not as technologically advanced as were the English. Now, the fact that they were not as technologically advanced as were the English is well explained by Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Steel, and Germs. And if you want to know why technology blossomed in what we call the Western countries like England and the United States and so forth, read Jared Diamond's monumental study on the bestseller list, the New York Times, for like 2 or 3 years in running. One of the most widely read history books ever written. Jared Diamond is not a historian. He's a bird physiologist, but he understood something about historical development, and he pulled it all together quite nicely. But regardless of why, the reality was that the people they encountered were not as technologically advanced, although they were advanced in other ways. Think about this. They were advanced in developing ideas about how to treat each other, how to treat older people within their society, how to treat children within their society. So they were very advanced in lots of different ways. They were very advanced in being able to live in very meager circumstances, in circumstances that many of us would not survive. So they were advanced in lots of ways, but not with that technological development. So that sudden contact, Jordan points out, occurred not only suddenly, but it occurred quite coincidentally at a moment in English history when the English had developed some cultural ideas about different colors. Now think about it. In our culture, we have associations, cultural associations with different colors. Why do we associate the color red with stop and the color green with go? That's a cultural invention. And somebody probably in the early automobile age just invented that. I don't know exactly how that color association emerged. But think about this, for example. What color do you associate with death? Well, in our culture and in the English culture in the 1500s, they associated death with the color black. But quite coincidentally, that had not always been the case in English culture. 300 years earlier, back in the 12 and 1300s, English had actually associated the color yellow with death. But over that 200 or 300 years, down to the 1500s, for various reasons, that had shifted. And they associated the color black with death and dirt. And they associated the color white with beauty and goodness and purity. Now that's a cultural invention that occurred for some very complex reasons within British or English culture. If you look, for example, at the makeup that people wore, take Queen Elizabeth, the first Elizabeth, the makeup that she wore was an attempt to make her skin whiter than she normally was. And that's because being extremely white was considered a mark of beauty, a mark of attractiveness. So the English took those cultural attitudes with them as they discovered these dark-skinned people living in sub-Saharan Africa. And as they encountered those people, Jordan argues, they were puzzled. They didn't know what to make of these people. They didn't know what to make about the kind of culture they had and the way they lived. Now, what does the human beings do when they see somebody living a different culture, living in different kinds of housing, for example? What do they assume? Usually we assume that different means you're inferior to my culture. If your culture is different than mine, then it's not as good as mine. That's the way human beings have for a long time tended to think. But now they're going to begin to think in a different kind of way in reference to this particular set of problems. So as they looked at these people and they began to puzzle over who are they and what are they like and why are they such a different culture and why are they a different color and why do they live in different kind of housing than we do? And they decided that the only way to explain it was that these people were a different kind of people. They weren't. They were as human as the English. But the English decided in their culture that the people that they were encountered in sub-Saharan Africa were somehow basically different. And thus was born the idea of race. And at the same time, the society in England, and I'm speaking of the late 1500s and the early 1600s, began to invent the idea of white people, and then subsequently of Black people. We now know a little bit about when that took place. By looking at the records that we have, which are voluminous, of writings in the early 1600s, of speeches that people made, researchers began to look for when was the first time that anyone referred to white people. And it seems that that occurred somewhere around 1616, 1615, 1617, somewhere along in there, in a play in London, when one of the actors in the play has the line, "All you white people." And so they began to think about people in those terms. I would remind you that up to this point, the English and much of the European culture had divided human beings into two broad groups, namely people who were, quote, royal, unquote, and people who were commoners, unquote. And you were either a royal or you were not. And if you were not, you were a commoner. That idea of dividing people into royals and commoners predated the idea of dividing people into Black and white. And so in this age of transition, in the 16 teens and the 1620s, the king of England at the time, James I, James VI of Scotland, he became James I, King of England. And he ruled from, I don't know, about, what was it? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
this is Lenny, Phyllis's husband. The sound goes in and out on our iPad. Does that happen with others?
I'm sorry. Are we okay now?
Now it's good.
Now is good. So if I lean forward, the sound is better?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. So with that, I don't know how much of this you followed. But
I think for most of us, we heard it perfectly fine. So
okay. All right.
don't worry about it.
Okay. Okay. So the English did have this idea of commoner and royal. And the King of England, James the First, was living in an age in which we were transitioning to an idea of black and white. But he was still very much embedded in the idea of dividing people according to whether or not they were royal or commoner. And so, for example, when he sent some people to North America, to a place called Virginia, or that the English call Virginia, one of his subjects came home from that excursion having acquired a new wife. We call the woman he married Pocahontas, although that was not her original name in her own culture. And so he came home with what some people said was an Indian bride. Now, James the First was very upset. And some people, looking back at how upset he was over John Rolfe's decision to marry this woman in North America, believe that he was upset because she was not white. But that's not the case. He was upset because John was a commoner and she was a princess within her culture. And so James, the king, was upset because John was corrupting her blood by marrying her, in his view of things. So if you think about that little story for a moment, you can begin to see how all of this is simply a human invention, a human decision to decide that some people belong in this group and some people belong in this group. So the English gradually develop in the 1600s this idea that white people are different and that therefore black people are different. And they brought those ideas with them to North America, to the English colonies where we live. And within the English colonies, those ideas flourished and continued to change. And I think it's important to understand why they changed and flourished within the English colonies of North America. There are many reasons, but there are three that I want you to consider today. The first is because they had this desire for cheap labor. But lots of people had desires for cheap labor, and they did not necessarily invent an idea of race or practice an idea of race. Most prominent example is another slave system that emerged in the Americas about the same time and lasted for about the same period of time as the slave system that existed in the English colonies. That was in Brazil. And a historian by the name of Carl Degler. Marcia, hand me that picture, would you? Gotta stop here just for a second. Show you a picture of Carl Degler. And I don't know, can you see this? Carl Degler, there he is on, what is that, the right, the shorter guy. Guess who the guy is on the left with lots of hair? That's me. We're standing in William Faulkner's front yard in about 1974. But Carl Degler was a historian at Stanford, and he asked questions about the Brazilian system of slavery. And he said, why didn't they develop an idea of race? Now, they eventually had borrowed the idea of race from us, from English-speaking people, and took it to Brazil, and it began to resonate with people in Brazil, but they didn't develop it originally. And so he began to think about the impact of something that may really surprise you. And it's a little bit disturbing. And what he began to realize is that the reason why we developed such a strong identity of race so much more quickly than did the Brazilians, for example, is that we had also developed this idea of equality. You know, Jefferson, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That equalitarianism, so Degler argues, actually ends up supporting and enlarging and enhancing our idea of race. Now, why? Well, as Degler explains it, he says, okay, we wanted cheap labor. So did the Brazilians. But the Brazilians could decide to put some people into slavery without deciding that those people were in fact inferior and deserved to be in slavery and couldn't survive outside of slavery. But in the United States, or what became the United States, because we had this idea of equality and also the idea of wanting cheap labor, we couldn't do that. If we had the idea of equality, we had to either decide that slavery was wrong and that we needed to get rid of it, or to decide that maybe the people in slavery deserved to be in slavery because they were just naturally slaves. They were a different breed of human being. And that's basically what the Jeffersonians, including old Thomas himself, decided was the case. And they invented this idea of what they called a necessary evil. And they preached that idea to themselves and to each other. And it's the idea that slavery was evil. Yes, we recognize that, but it was a necessary evil because the people being enslaved couldn't survive on their own, they decided, were inferior to white people, and were intended by God and nature to be slaves. And they came up with that contorted rationalization, Degler argues, because they wanted to hold on to their ideas of equalitarianism, and they wanted to hold on to their cheap labor. And then, as other historians point out, there's the third factor that began to emerge, in the early 1800s. Actually, during Jefferson's administration, but having absolutely nothing to do with Thomas himself. And is this, and disturbingly, it's because of a religious revival. A religious revival that swept across the American frontier in particular, but also into the eastern part of the United States as well, in this area, for example. And this religious revival that swept across English America, if we can call it that, the United States, preached a new theology. And that new theology said that to be saved and to go to heaven, you had to be born again. You had to be a born again Christian. Now, this theology emerged mostly among Protestants, but some Catholics as well. You had to be a born again Christian. And to be a born again Christian, you had to reject all evil. There could be nothing called a necessary evil, because you as a Christian person had to reject all evil to be born again, to be born into the life of Christ. Well, they accepted that theology, but it presented a dilemma for them. They now either had to decide that slavery was wrong and that slaves should be freed immediately, or they had to decide that slavery wasn't a necessary evil, but that it was a necessary goodness. And that is what they decided to do. And over about a 20 or 30-year period, they moved toward that position theologically and politically. And it is during that period that they began to search the scriptures for stories that could justify their slavery. And they happened upon the curse of Ham as one justification. But these were all invented interpretations of the scripture to justify an institution and to call it good, to call it God's God's intended project for human beings, that part of human beings would be enslaved. And so they began to believe that slavery and second-class position for people of color was not a necessary evil. It was a necessary goodness that they tended to celebrate now. And that became the driving force. Now, why did they do that? They did that because they were caught between a rising desire to have cheap slaves. The cotton economy across the South began to blossom. Back in the 1800s, Southern farmers grew everything from hemp to vegetables, but they didn't grow much cotton, because the only kind of cotton that they knew that would grow widely was very difficult to get the seeds out of it. And a guy by the name of Eli Whitney came up with a contraption for extracting the seeds from this variety of cotton that could be grown from Virginia all the way down to Texas, and could be grown relatively easily, but would require constant attention from cheap labor. And they were edged on by that shift in crops because of the changes within the economy, the international economy. Textile mills in New England and textile mills in England needed lots of cotton to make the cloth that they would now sell and drive their economy. And to make that cloth out of cotton, they needed to grow the cotton. To grow the cotton, they needed lots of cheap labor. And so they were much more encouraged to think of slavery, hold on to slavery, but they had to come up with a rationalization for that slavery. And they did so by deciding that it was good and not evil. And then they began also to do so because they feared their own slaves, because their slaves began to revolt. They had revolted all along, and then began to rise up and revolt in increased numbers. And when Nat Turner rose up in revolts in 1831 and gathered together a few followers and went house to house, and the first act they carried out to free the slaves on what we call plantations, what maybe should be called forced labor camps. As they began to do so, they killed all the white people. Not a pretty scene, but that struck fear in the minds of white people, and slave owners in particular. And so they were afraid to free their slaves. For a while, they found some favor in the idea of, well, we'll just ship them to Africa, a place where none of these people had ever been. Their ancestors had been ripped from Africa and brought to the Americas, but they weren't. They'd always lived here, but all of a sudden to be sent to Africa. It was very popular during the administration of James Monroe in particular. And one of the places they began to ship people was to Liberia, and it's no accident that the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after James Monroe. So all of these forces put together meant that we produced a culture, especially in the South, in which the people began to believe that slavery was a natural good created by nature and God, and that to violate that general pact with nature would be some sort of catastrophe. And so the idea of race became deeply embedded in our culture and ourselves. Now, when I was about, 20-something, my young bride and I decided, well, okay, if race was an invention, something that just emerged within our culture for historical reasons, why couldn't we uninvent it and rear our children with no concept of race? And that's what we set out to do. And we had two beautiful children, and we tried to teach them that notion that you hear this idea of race, but it's just an invention. But people are people are people are people are people. And they are not different because of the color of their skin or the color of their eyes or how tall they are or how tall their faces are or whether they have hair on the back of their fingers. We're all just people, and people are people are people. So that's the end of my message. People are people are people. And the idea of race is a human invention. But one coda to all of this. So please think about this. While the idea of race is a human invention, racism is real. Racism and the people who suffered from racism, from racial categories, are real people. And their history and their families have been changed. because of the existence of this idea, this malignant idea, this cancerous idea of race. So race is a human invention. It doesn't exist in nature. But racism is a reality within our culture and our history. Thanks very much. Are there any questions? Have we got time? I'm game. Otherwise, I'm gonna go take a dip in the ocean.
Hello, my name is Sandy. Hello.
Hi.
Hello, my name is Sandy. Hello.
Hello, I hear you, Andy.
My name is Sandy. Hello.
Sandy?
I hear you, Sandy.
We can hear you.
Yeah,
I can hear you.
I just wanted to thank you so much. That was excellent and so needed right now as far as the talk. Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Phyllis and Melissa and Michael and everybody.
You're very kind.
Well, really, thank you. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Shirley Gordon. May I speak?
Yes, please,
Please.
Shirley. Go ahead.
I wanted to know the rationale then between 1619 and the Jeffersonian idea when actually Africans were sent over here. And that's my question.
Well, the 1619 project is a brilliant project. And the essay that Nicole Hannah Jones wrote that won her the Pulitzer Prize for essay writing last year is a brilliant piece of writing.
I agree.
In which she put together a lot of this history in much more detail and much more brilliantly than I've done here this morning. I must tell you a story from my own life. You know, I'm a history professor, now retired, but for many, many years, I taught U.S. history at different universities. And back in the 1970s, I decided to do my own 1619 project. I was teaching U.S. history in the U.S. History Survey course, which is supposed to be, you know, everything from, I don't know, 1500 to the present.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided to change that course and to do the entire course around the concept of race and to look at the impact of the idea of race upon various developments in American history. And what I discovered was, wow, I had an incredibly full, rich story to tell. It wasn't always a happy story. But I had to cut out some things. Yeah, I didn't go into the bank wars during the Jackson administration. I wasn't terribly interested in those. But we looked at everything else in terms of the impact that that idea of race had upon such things as the Declaration of Independence and the arguments that the Declaration of Independence and the whole revolutionary movement in 1776 emerged in part because slave owners were afraid that the English crown was going to outlaw slavery. And there is some evidence that that in fact was the case. So we looked at those arguments and we looked at ways of evaluating those arguments. So I was immersed in my own 1619 project going all the way back to the 70s. But Nicole Hannah Jones did it far more brilliantly than I ever did. And when I read that essay, I cried. And I took it to my grandchildren and I said, if you want to learn to write and to think, you need to read this essay. Did she make some mistakes? Yeah, a few here and there. Did she grasp the overall picture of what has happened in American history? Yeah, she did grasp the overall picture, and brilliantly. And she wrote about it in a powerful way, beginning with her own family. I'm now teaching a course to some young high school students about how to write. And part of what we've done is to look at that essay and to examine what she does and how she builds the story in that essay. And it's very effective. I'm not sure if I answered your question or not. Go ahead.
May I speak?
Of course.
Okay. Throughout your comments, which were wonderful and so needed, I thought of my friend, whom many of you in South Orange may have known. Her name is Lee May. She was married to Earl May, the famous jazz bass player. She grew up in South Orange, and she told a story of growing up Black in a pretty white town, living in a certain area where the working class, and these are her words, lived. But she said she had such an idyllic childhood here that her parents were worried that she wouldn't understand what racism was.
Yeah.
So they sent her to Alabama for one summer. And when she arrived, her uncle came and got her off the plane. He was in the army, and he was in military dress, and he had I forget his rank, but it was a higher rank. And she was a little surprised, but then she got it right away, because he walked her through the airport and he showed her the fountains for white and colored. And that's the first time she ever saw that. And then they drove to his home, and there were signs that, similar to our Rotary signs, that were Ku Klux Klan signs.
Yeah.
And as she said, then she knew.
Yeah. Well, I'm a child of an Alabama family. My parents were born on a place in Alabama called Sand Mountain. It's called Sand Mountain because most of the soil was sand. A very poor area, and it's a very, very racist community. And when my parents had moved across the border just barely into Georgia when I was born. So I was born in a place called Summerville, Georgia, and lived in Lyerly, Georgia, but only for a year of my life. And, you know, I had 88 first cousins because both of my parents came from families of 12 to 14 children.
Oh my God.
So I had a lot of first cousins, and most of them remained in the South and in Alabama, in Georgia. And I must say, grew up with very different ideas than I did. Now, why and where and how did I escape that disease? Well, I didn't escape it entirely. You know, it just hangs in your head. You know, how do you get rid of that notion of thinking about people in terms of their skin color? How do you get rid of that entirely? Well, it's difficult to do, but I've been thinking about recently, as a result of some developments that took place, about things that made a difference to me as a young child of Alabama, growing up in Missouri and then going to school in Texas. And there were two stories that I remember quite clearly. And one was the story of Emmett Till, who was 2 years older than I was. So when I was 12 years old and he was 14, you know, he was brutally butchered. And then the people who butchered him were brought to trial, and then they were acquitted. And then they said, yeah, we did it. And that really struck me as a 12-year-old. And then when I was 19 and a freshman in college, there was another guy who was about 2 years older than me. He was 21 at the time, and he was going to college in Nashville, Tennessee. I was going to college in Waco, Texas. And I began to read about this young man and what he and his followers were doing. And he organized a sit-in at a Woolworth lunch counter to protest the segregation. Then his name was John Lewis. He had a deep impact on me. So it's been a kind of a tough week.
Yeah.
But he was one of my heroes when I was growing up. That helped me to escape the ideas. But, you know, in South Orange, we live in a bubble that is very different. That's not to say that we don't have racism. We have systematic racism. And our schools are more segregated than the schools, for example, of Morristown, New Jersey. Look at the statistics. We have segregated schools in South Orange. But the people in South Orange don't intend that. It's a brilliant example, a disturbing example of how structures can even override the intentions of the residents of a particular community. In South Orange, we have systematic racism that segregates the community and creates a different experience for white and black children. But, you know, on a daily basis, and I think about my community living right here on Wesley Court, of how integrated that community is. Now we've broken down those barriers of race and racism that were created 300 or 400 years ago. And that's brilliant and that's reassuring. But we have lots of work to do to deal with the systematic racism that pervades our society, not just in South Orange, but even on a larger scale across the country.
I was interested to see comments of Black men and women, young men and women who had graduated Columbia High School.
Yes.
They were online recently. And one of them really struck me, which was that people here think they are not racist, white people, because there are so many Black people in the community that they grew up with, because they don't see all the things, all the ways that there was this subtle discrimination, and sometimes not subtle, through school.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very difficult concept to grasp. It's if you're not racist and the other people around you are not so racist, but yet the structures of your culture, your society are basically racist. How do you account for that difference, and what do you do about it? Very frustrating and very difficult for people to grasp. I know in the years that I taught, that was the most difficult concept to get students to grasp and to think about. How do you have structural racism? If everybody is saying, oh no, we're all equal, we're all the same. Well, in part, we maintain that structural racism by maintaining this division of Black people and white people and thinking that that really tells you something. It does only in this sense to look at a Black family and say that your family has been far more likely to be a victim of racial discrimination than my family. But that's not to say you're inherently different or wrong. So, yeah, we got a lot of work to do to think this through for our children.
We do.
Hello, I have a question. I'm in the phone.
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
Hello. Okay, I heard someone, a commentaries, saying that in this country we don't have racism because otherwise we couldn't elect a black president. What do you think about that?
I'm sorry, I missed your question. Can you articulate it again?
Okay.
I'm a little hard of hearing.
Yeah. Okay. A commentarist that say that there is no racism in United States because otherwise we couldn't elect a black president. He means Obama. So what do you think?
I wish that were the case. I wish that were the case. But unfortunately,
because majority that vote, it was not only black, it was the majority of white people voting for him.
Right. Exactly. Well, yeah, but what's true of some is not necessarily true of the whole.
That's true. Yeah.
So some people did vote against him because he was black.
Okay.
But that's not really the major issue. The major issue is that the racism that persists and is so troublesome is structural. It's not within the attitudes of any one individual. It's the structures that we live under that are very complex, and there's a very rich body of literature that we could begin to explore. My publisher, Harvard University Press, has just put out a book of collected essays on race and racism that you can download right now free of charge. If you go to their website, you can download that work. That it pulls together ideas and essays and chapters from a wide number of different books that they've published over recent years. But I think we need to do a lot of thinking and understanding about the nature of structural racism and the meaning of structural racism. But unfortunately, you know, it's still with us. You know, I've heard some people who would never practice any discrimination at all, but yet they will ask questions like someone asked me recently, are South Americans white people? Now, where does that idea come from, man? How do you ask? That's like asking, are South Americans tall? You know, the question makes as much sense as, are South Americans tall, or do South Americans all have blue eyes? Well, the answer is no. But, you know, and some are tall and some are short. But they ask that question because they can't escape from the idea of race. And you know, I've gone through a personal journey of years of trying to escape, to extract myself from the idea of race and the idea that race tells us anything about human beings, because it doesn't. There are lots of other things that can tell us something about how they act. You know, can tell us a lot about particular human beings, but the concept of race can't, except to the degree that it may be able to tell us, you know, these people have been victims of racism. So again, it's the notion that race is an invention, but racism, a human invention, but racism is real. And it's affected people and their families and their descendants.
And wouldn't you say that this past few months, seeing all the people marching, white and black, and for black lives matter. Wouldn't you say that that's the most encouraging thing we've seen in forever in America? We never saw so many white people, young and old, marching together
Yeah.
to try to see racism disappear.
And I think that's a wonderful development.
I
All
do
I'm
too.
saying is that it doesn't go far enough. We've
And you
still
know,
got lots to do. We can take comfort in that, but we don't want to relax.
No, we can't.
No, we've still got a lot more to do to undo the idea of race. So there's a lot of work for us and for our children to undo the idea of race. And that's going to take a lot of work. So I'm encouraged by the events of recent weeks and the very strong reaction that existed. I remember, John Lewis said, Emmett Till was my George Floyd. And mine too. There was reaction to the killing of Emmett Till in 1954, I guess. But not as strong a reaction as has existed for the reaction to the killing of George Floyd. And that's a good thing. The killing itself was
modern
not.
technology. People were able to see it. Oh,
Yeah.
Not to introduce a less uplifting thought, but with people marching together, yes, that's wonderful and it's uplifting. But if those of us who are experiencing white privilege are not acknowledging that the results of marching come with much higher stakes for those of us who aren't white, then it's easy for those who are joining the march to say, I'm fully in on this. But you have to acknowledge you're never going to suffer the same consequences.
Yes.
Whether it's a march that, has federal troops brought in on it, or it's a march that you go back and talk to your friends about, you're still doing it from a different place. And I think it's really important that everybody who is totally behind this acknowledge that side of white privilege. It's really easier for us to be talking up about it or walking in protest or saying, I'm colorblind. Well, that doesn't mean anything because
Exactly.
as our speaker brilliantly pointed out, racism is real. It's systematic, it's systemic, and if we don't look at it from that really boring back end, we're not gonna fix things.
No.
Marching is great and people coming together is great, but it's gotta go deeper than that.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for expressing those views so articulately.
yes, you did.
It's a difficult problem. And I've always thought of race and racism as a kind of social disease, and it affects your brain and it affects your way of thinking and looking at the world and looking at history. And to escape from that is enormously difficult. But it makes sense.
We need teachers like you. We need leaders and teachers like you to tell people what it is.
You're very kind. I appreciate that. But I think we just need to continue to examine this history, and there's some extraordinarily good literature on this history that has emerged since Winthrop Jordan wrote his monumental book in the 1960s. We need to explore that. We need to make that a part of getting an education.
Well, thank you. Ken, I hope that you come back in the fall around December 7th. Like you did December 7th. And go back and make the changes that are going to be good for the
Yeah.
United States and for people and for all people. Because we want
Thank
people
you.
to be healthy and happy.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting.
Very
It
nice.
was
Very
brilliant.
nice.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank
Thank
Okay.
you all.
And Mike.
you,
Mike will
guys.
get those on you.
Bye-bye.